Alright, Trajanus here with a new series where we will be playing Late Age Flegra in Lucid's 2022 tournament. This is the qualifier rounds, not the final. Specifically, this will be Game 10. I think there was like around almost 20 games if I recall. This was not actually a game I was planning on playing. I was on the sub list. And we had the unusual situation where after the nation selections happened, someone needed to step down immediately before even submitting a build, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to jump in. I didn't quite realize it at the time, but it's definitely oversubscribed in games. I also had never played Late Age Flegra before, not even in single player, really knew very little about the nation. Still would not call myself an expert with them, or possibly even competent. I am recording this after the majority of the game has been played, so I know a lot more now going over the nation than I will at the start of the game, so if you see me doing things that I have said are not a good idea, it's because I learned that in the game itself. So without further ado, let's jump into Late Age Flegra, at least as far as I understand them. To start with, I have played Mouflon, which is their early age equivalent, and things did not go well for the Gigantes. They lost their war against the gods, they were cursed, and then they went insane. Otherwise, things haven't really changed too much, mostly the same kind of magic that you'd see before in Mouflon, along with plenty of slavery for the humans. In fact, they've even expanded it. So to talk about the troop lineup first, the majority of your units are slave units. In fact, I believe the only ones that are not are the Cyclops soldiers, and they're just normal units. And then the Iron Guard are slave units, in addition to being magic beings. So they're a little bit different because they have higher morale than most of your other slave units, which means that from a gold standpoint, your armies are pretty cheap. From a resource standpoint, your armies are very painful. So the majority of their units have very high resource cost, which is not that unusual in the late age, though I would say that Flegra is a bit, on the heavier side in terms of the resource need. So you'll probably want production scales. Flegra also notably no sacred units and very few sacred mages. In fact, other than the, priest, who is just a priest and therefore also sacred, it's only your slow to recruit capital only oppressor archon that is also sacred. So you might think that Flegra wouldn't want to bless, and certainly, for what we're looking at here, you absolutely don't. So scales is, I think, a totally viable choice. However, because of the tyrants, who actually aren't even listed here because you cannot recruit them at the start of the game, we'll talk about the tyrants later, but I do think there is a decent argument to be made for putting shrouds onto your tyrants and then giving them some sort of bless. So you probably don't want to bless unless you want to try to bless your tyrants. Well, no, let me rephrase that. You definitely don't want to bless unless you're going to bless your tyrants, which you might want to do. So in terms of the actual recruitable units, breaking the resource trend is the Heal It Archer, and this unit is pretty worthless. He has a short bow, almost no protection, pretty terrible skills and weapons. I like archers. You are a fire nation, so you can do flaming arrows. But in the late age, there's so much heavy armor running around that the short bow makes these guys really, really worthless. But really, the only advantage they have, I would say, is you can recruit a lot of them really quickly. And they are pretty cheap to recruit, and not magic resistance. Their morale, right? The upkeep is very low, which is true for the majority of your units, but these guys are even a bit lower probably because they're less to recruit. Actually, I take that back. They're the same as the majority of your other slave troops. So other than the fact that they're cheaper to recruit, they're not even cheaper to keep around. So I do use these some. I think they're okay patrol chaff because they're so cheap and so quick to bring in. And then possibly if you get in a really desperate situation where a bunch of flaming arrows is going to help you out, maybe Lemuria early in the game, right? You just need some magic damage like quickly before you have a lot of research. But short of using these guys as patrollers, and even as patrollers, because their combat value is so low, it is kind of questionable. So maybe a few niche cases, but mostly I would say avoid these guys. Next up is your other archer option. You have a crossbow. Actually costs the same to bring in, so everything that I said about cost, possibly just a lie there. Yeah, definitely just a lie there. As I said, far from an expert at late age Flegra here. But while the gold is the same and, recruitment points are not a concern, 26 resources for just a crossbowman unit is a little eye-watering, and it can make these guys pretty tough to mass up. And numbers is really the main thing you want when you're recruiting ranged units. So in a lot of ways, these guys are inferior to a lot of the indie crossbows that you run into. Because they're so heavily armored, they're not completely abysmal in melee, though really mostly just as acting as a blocker. Their skills are pretty awful. Attack 9 with their short sword, 15 sometimes pierce damage. It's not going to be great, and they're probably not going to stick around that long at morale 6. You can boost this significantly with some of your Taskmaster leaders, but morale is always going to be a problem for late-age Flegra. Right, so the fact that these guys are so cheap to maintain is really useful. So if you can recruit them up in decent numbers, if you've placed your forts intelligently, then these guys, aren't the worst, but that heavy armor on an archer unit isn't fantastic. Next up, we have the Heal-It Soldier, also, really high in resource cost. And frankly, kind of unimpressive all around. He has the same level of protection as the crossbowman that we just looked at. He's got an 11 attack, slashing damage, broadsword. So in some cases, against heavy armor, the crossbowmen are actually going to be a little better, assuming they can actually land a hit. They're only at attack skill 9 versus attack skill 11, but these aren't really very impressive values. The Heal-It Soldier does have much higher defense skill, which is significant. And they do have a shield, so they're going to do a bit better against arrow fire, really like crossbow fire. Slightly higher morale. They can also be promoted, which is actually kind of annoying because they will promote into the Iron Guard, which we'll talk more about in a second. But Iron Guard are magic beings, so they have to be led by a mage. So, you're going to have your regular units being led around by regular commanders, and then all of a sudden they're going to promote, and now you need to lead them with a mage. It doesn't happen too often. These guys don't often survive that long. So it's not a huge problem, but, this is it's kind of a benefit. And I mean, don't get me wrong, the Ironbound are definitely better in a lot of ways, but they also have some downsides. So yeah, I don't love this promotion. I don't love this unit. If you need a front line, I guess you could recruit these guys. For a lot of the game, I kind of just tried to use the crossbowmen as a front line and then, summons. Which isn't fantastic, but it does work. So, you could get away with not recruiting these guys, I think. But at the same time, if you just need a blocker, they are very cheap. But again, kind of hard to mass unless you've placed your forts well. And that brings us to the Iron Guard, which is capital only recruitment. So you're never going to have a ton of these guys. And of course, some of your other units can promote into them. So if you really like these guys, maybe you do want to recruit, a bunch more of these Heal-It Soldiers and really try to lean into the promotion mechanic. But I think that's going to be hard to pull off because, like I said, they tend not to survive. These guys are pretty expensive across the board, but they do come with some pretty significant advantages. Strength is significantly higher. For a human unit, attack and defense skill are actually respectable. Protection is a bit higher. 18 is actually pretty good. Significantly higher hit points. For a human unit, this is pretty good. Also importantly, excellent morale, which is a rarity for Flegra. They have lower map move than a lot of other Flegran units, which is actually kind of annoying. You're not particularly fast anyway, but these guys are even slower, so you can pretty much forget about 2 province moves with these guys, which is a bit sad, but not the end of the world. I think the bigger knock against them is they have magic resistance 9. I do not end up using these guys all that much, which is possibly a mistake, right? I looked at this. It's a more expensive unit with worse magic resistance. So I felt that it's I don't really want to spend more gold on a unit that I'm going to end up donating. But I think I overestimated the frequency of magic resistance spells. Don't get me wrong, these guys absolutely will start to fall off in the mid game and the late game, and it matters a lot in terms of what nation you're up against. If you're up against a nation that has a lot of paths that use magic resistance spells, it's going to be extra painful when these guys get hit. But the difference between magic resistance 9 and the magic resistance 10 of the rest of your units is probably relatively negligible. So really the main downside is just that okay, you're losing more gold when you lose these guys. But, you know, looking at them again now, like particularly early on, I think you can get a lot of good use out of these guys. So I think it's probably a mistake that I didn't lean into these a little bit more, but I would be careful about overusing them, right? Because they do have that pretty significant magic resistance hole. They're also bodyguards, which is not something that's come up yet, but could be pretty useful. And of course, you know, since they're magic beings, they have to be led by a mage, which can be a little annoying in some situations, though you do have plenty of options for mage leadership in this nation. So not a huge deal. Of course, again, being capital only, you'll never have a ton of these guys. And then that brings us to the Mouflon cataphracts, which I think probably their best unit, Flegra's best unit. And this is primarily because, you know, they're relatively gold cheap heavy cavalry. I am perhaps a bit biased since I like heavy cavalry. They're still quite high in terms of resource and recruitment point cost. The recruitment point cost being kind of significant, also somewhat significant for the Iron Guard, though the Iron Guard are significantly lower in terms of recruitment point cost. But, you know, if you want to tank your order turmoil scale, right, if you want to take really heavy turmoil, which you can absolutely do, you can take full turmoil and still, you know, recruit a ton of these Helot soldiers and a ton of these Helot crossbowmen. But, you know, Iron Guard might get a little trickier, and like Mouflon, it could be a big problem. So that recruitment point requirement is a bit of an anti-synergy here with some of the other things you might want to try to do. But otherwise, like a fairly normal heavy cavalry, skills a bit lower than a lot of other units. But protection, you know, pretty high. And the gold recruitment cost is pretty low for heavy cavalry, and the upkeep is kind of bananas for heavy cavalry. They do have mountain survival, which is kind of nice, but I don't think it's super relevant. You do have a few commanders with mountain survival, but it's pretty unlikely that you're going to utilize that too much. They also provide a supply bonus, which is kind of nice, but not that big a deal. But yeah, these are like solid mundane units. They can absolutely raid provinces and make up, you know, a good chunk of your army. In terms of the killing power, no magic weapons so far, which brings us to the Cyclops soldiers. And these guys kind of share some similarities to the Ironbound. You're not limited in terms of capital recruitment, but you can only recruit, you know, so many of them out of each fort. Yeah, you're limited to 3. I had to look that up because I did not use these guys that much. And this I actually regret a little bit more. You know, like I said, I think they have the same problem as the Iron Guard, only more so. So again, they have that same like low magic resistance. But now you're investing a lot of gold into these guys. But what you get is pretty significant. So, you know, they have a lot of hit points. You know, being size 4 giants, a boatload of strength. They do have a magic weapon, which is pretty important, or at least can be in some scenarios. Really high protection at 19, you know, decent enough stats, and better than average morale, better than your average map move, though still a little on the low side. But kind of the same scenario, right? Like later in the game, I think these guys are going to fall off even harder because you're just never going to be able to recruit that many of them. So, you know, things like Enslave Mind or Soul Slay are going to matter a lot more for these, you know, a lot more expensive, fewer in number units that are very, very vulnerable to those kind of spells. So I just felt like, if I invest, you know, a bunch of resources into them, it's just going to open me up to those sort of attacks. And there's no shortage of Astral in the late age. All of that said, I found early on, late age Flegra actually tends to have a decent amount of gold floating around. And it's definitely not the case later. But because your other troops are so cheap to upkeep and relatively cheap to recruit, your gold problems don't hit you right away. And I don't think it'd be crazy to invest some of that gold in these guys. Like, they are pretty effective troops. I think, you know, for your first war, you could potentially run someone over with these, or maybe even prevent yourself from getting rolled over. But just be aware that, you know, they do have a shelf life, and that, you know, in the mid to late game, you're pretty much just setting yourself up for a lot of pain. Also of note, they are quite haughty, which they got from the Gigantes, and they refuse to be led by anyone smaller than them. They are also gluttons, so supply is a bit more of a problem. The leadership size situation is a bit of a problem for late age Flegra. You only have 2 commanders, right, that can lead them, and, you know, one of them you probably don't want to be sending into combat. And so, you know, these guys, they're at least only 1 recruitment point, so you could get 2 of them out of a fort in 1 turn. But, you know, you can't use indie commanders to lead these guys around. You do need to use fort turns to provide leadership for these Cyclops soldiers. So I think this is a nation that really would benefit from trying to force a lot of attritional fights, assuming that you've placed your forts well. Also kind of assuming production 3, because otherwise you're really going to struggle to bring the replacements in. Sure, you can pay for them, but you just can't get them out of your forts quickly enough. Now let's talk about their commanders and mages. So they have a Phlegran commander. Not really that notable. He is a slave, so upkeep is relatively low. That also means that his morale is pretty low, but he is a taskmaster, so he's going to make your slave troops have increased morale, though not by enough to really say that they have good morale. Still, there isn't really anything particularly wrong with this guy. I will say that I found myself recruiting more of these than I normally do. So normally for a commander like this, I would say don't bother and recruit the indie commanders, but because of the situation you're in with your slave troops, you may want to consider recruiting these guys. That said, you do probably have better options, though they will require you to give up research. Then you have your Cyclops commander, and I think really the main, probably only use for this guy is to lead around your Cyclops soldiers. You could try to thug him. He wouldn't be the worst thug. You're bringing him in for gold rather than for gems. But again, he has a huge glaring weakness. Like, you're never going to be able to cover this. He at least has a built-in magic weapon, but he's not a mage. So, you could use him to thug. Probably actually would be better as like a counter thug if there was, a nasty pretender or super combatant you needed to get rid of. These guys might work for you, but again, that low magic resistance is going to be a big problem. They also don't have the best skills, but with some limited gear investment, you could probably make them work. So yeah, mostly for leading around your Cyclopses, if you choose to use them. Same level of Taskmaster as your human commander. Greater leadership, but still no formations, so not really a huge upgrade there. Not worth it probably in terms of the extra gold. So unless you want to use these Cyclops soldiers, probably not really going to recruit a ton of these guys. Next up is the Phlegran Cataphract Commander. This guy's kind of nice because you can move around quite quickly. So if you want to have a fast group, or at least faster group of Mouflon with him, you can do that. At 2 recruitment points, it's kind of a lot of fort turns to be wasting on something like that. Probably you're just going to be using this guy as like a main army commander because he does have 80 leadership, which unlocks formations. He's also a Taskmaster +3, so pretty good morale boost to your slave units. The other tags, not so relevant. The Mouflon actually apparently helping out his magic resistance, but otherwise like a fairly decent, fairly tanky for a human commander, which is kind of nice. So again, because the 2 recruitment points, you can't get quite as many of them. You're not going to want to use these guys everywhere, but as army leaders, I think they do perfectly fine. Next up is your dedicated priest, a little more expensive than normal to bring in, but like most of Flegra's units, cheaper to upkeep. He's a level 1 priest, which is pretty awful. He does at least have some leadership, right? So you could use him to lead units around. He's only a Taskmaster +1, so not as good as the other leaders we've looked at. But I think probably the main reason that you would want to recruit him is that he reduces unrest in whatever province that he's in. Some people really advocate for this guy, and I guess we probably should pause here and talk about why that's extra important for late age Flegra. So it turns out having all this slavery causes a little bit of unrest. And for late age Flegra, any province that's under their dominion just gets some increased unrest. That unrest is apparently directly tied to your dominion strength, which I did not know until just now. And according to the wiki, the formula is the number of candles divided by 2. It's not actually clear whether that's the amount that it increases by every turn or the cap. Just from having played the nation, it does kind of seem like the unrest doesn't continually tick up, so I'm guessing that's about where it stabilizes. Again, according to the wiki, if you were to take a Dominion Strength 10 Flegra, which is the max Dominion Strength, which I definitely don't recommend, and you patrolled down all the unrest every turn, you would lose 10% of the gold income of that province. So back to our priest, right? Unrest is something that's going to be all over your lands. And of course, patrolling out the unrest kills some of the population. This guy reduces unrest without killing the population. In addition, just because of some of the weirdness of Dominion's mechanics and the timing, this effect occurs before income calculation, whereas patrolling occurs after. So in theory, this guy's even better. All that said, I don't really use too many of these guys in this playthrough. I experimented with them a little bit and wasn't super impressed. Again, you're going to end up needing to use fort turns to bring them in. You can't foreign recruit them, which isn't great because other than the fact that they're reducing unrest, they're kind of useless other than maybe shuffling troops around. And when I did some limited testing, and I mean, you really need like a stack of like 4 or 6 of these guys to make a dent in like some of the more significant unrest events that are probably going to happen. Now, I took fairly heavy, I took full misfortune and some turmoil. So, we'll talk more about my specific scales later. But what I found is just like with the amount of unrest that I was getting, I was gonna need patrollers anyway. And it just didn't really seem worthwhile to bother with these guys. Now, potentially with different scales, you could maybe make a case for, massing a few of these guys in some of your more valuable provinces, like your capital, or, there's some really high income farmland that you get a hold of, you just stack some priests there to help keep the unrest down and, you don't have terrible scales. Then maybe these guys are worthwhile in some limited numbers, but I definitely don't have as high opinion of them as some players do. Though I will say that, the way that I played definitely ran into some gold problems. And that brings us to the magic of the nation, which, as I said before, is mainly elemental with some important caveats. So one of the important national features of Flegra is their, immediate communions, their turn 1 communions. So powered, of course, by slavery. What else would Flegra be doing? Their mages do not have to cast Communion Master or Communion Slave to actually set up a communion. When they start the battle, they're already in a communion. This is a pretty major advantage when you're trying to get spells off quickly, which you pretty much always should be trying to do. Unfortunately, their communions have the major disadvantage of being terrible. I will steal once again from the wiki, which states that Flegra can cobble together brutal communions. And this is extremely accurate. So your only communion slave is the shackled mage, who is pretty cheap, but otherwise does not have a lot going for them. They are always forced into a communion, so if there's any communion masters on the field, including enemy ones, though I haven't actually tested that myself, they won't be able to cast any spells. So you really shouldn't be using these guys independently of communions. You might be able to get away with it in some scenarios where you're not expecting any enemy mages, but it's always going to be risky. Not shown here, but definitely a thing. They also just tend to come in with afflictions because slavery is bad and these guys are badly mistreated. And if you want to utilize Flegra's communions, you will be forced to continue and worsen that mistreatment. And that is because they come in with one random path of one of the elemental paths. And that is it. That's really all there is to say about this guy for the moment, because we have to talk about the other end of the communion to really fully understand him, other than the fact that he's also not very good at researching. Though being very cheap to upkeep, possibly like okay in terms of research efficiency. I actually haven't really done any comparison, but it is going to be pretty slow research. Still, I think you will end up recruiting quite a few of these guys. And that is primarily because the flagrant oppressors are kind of useless without them. So the oppressors get split paths, one in every level. They'll be missing one elemental path, basically, but they have a chance at any elemental path and are guaranteed to have 3 elemental paths at level 1. And there's just not a lot of spells that you can cast at level 1 for a lot of these paths, which means when these guys aren't wired into a communion, they can't really do that much, which means you will be building communions, but it's not possible to build a communion that will not have off-path casting, because the shackled mages will only have one elemental path, whereas these guys are guaranteed to have a spread of 3. So even if you gather up a bunch of shackled mages of a particular magic path, which can be kind of a pain to do since they get a random path, but even if you do bother to do it, right, these oppressors are guaranteed to have 2 paths that those shackled mages will not have. This gets slightly better if you choose to use the Oppressor Generals, which we'll talk a bit more about in a second, because they only have 2 elemental paths, but that's still 1 elemental path that those communion slaves are guaranteed to not have. So all of your communions are going to feature off-path casting, which is very fatiguing on a fragile and affliction-filled unit. Which is to say, like, you're probably going to be burning out a lot of communions as Flegra. Certainly, if you really push the balance towards having a lot of shackled mages, then, the battle doesn't go on too long, then you won't always burn out the communion. But for me, it kind of got to the point where I just accepted that any shackled mages we were bringing into a combat were going to die due to the communion, and so I would bring more or less the minimum number necessary to get off whatever spells I was trying to get off. You'll probably, and I usually would, bring like 1 or 2 extra, just because arrows will fly around and kill communion slaves sometimes. You don't want the communion to collapse immediately. But otherwise, like, while it does reduce its overall longevity in terms of how long the oppressors are going to be able to spam out spells, because once they lose the communion slaves, they lose that boost. But, they can usually cast things like Phoenix power and Earth power, things like that. So at that point, there are at least 2 in a path, and they can cast some useful spells at that point, and they will get a decent number of rounds still where they are wired into a communion and can cast, bigger stuff. Otherwise, there isn't a whole lot to say about the oppressors. They're pretty typical dudes in robes, with the notable exception that they have okay leadership, right? So you can use these guys to lead around units, which is really the main reason that you don't necessarily need a bunch of flagrant commanders. You can just use your oppressors to lead units around. But of course, that does mean that, you're going to lose out on that research. They're even the same level of Taskmaster, so from a morale standpoint, there's no difference. Though notably, the oppressor's morale is also quite low. And since these are some of the few, right, these are the enslavers, not the enslaved, so can't get them a Taskmaster bonus. Like I said, morale is a bit of a problem across the board for late age Flegra. So yeah, brutal elemental communions, that is mostly what you're looking at for your magic access. The Oppressor Generals kind of, slot into the middle. They're a bit of an odd one. I didn't recruit a ton myself, which perhaps was a mistake. I don't hate them, but I just kind of always found it hard to justify spending more gold on a mage that has 1 less path. It's not the end of the world because, there's still like the level 1 magic split. Like, they're not that different than the oppressors, but they are less versatile, and you do lose out, sometimes on some useful cross path spells. Of course, what you gain is a mage that's not a dude in robes. So he's a lot less likely to get sniped by some random arrow, which is definitely a concern. And these guys actually have like pretty solid leadership. You can do formations with them. So yeah, I don't hate them. I just didn't really see the point too much. I mean, the arrows aren't great, but usually you're bringing a lot of oppressors to a fight anyway, and ideally you're offloading your important spells onto other mages, or maybe throwing a few pieces of gear on them for increased survivability. So I guess you're saving the gems if you're using an Oppressor General instead. So yeah, like I said, I don't hate them. I think you could make a case for them, but they are a weaker mage for more gold, which isn't a great place to be. And that brings us to the cap only part of the lineup. So you can recruit Cyclops Smiths, who also are not great. They do at least have very high magic resistance, a rarity in Flegra's lineup, and they have a lot more hit points, so they are a very survivable mage, which is pretty nice for a nation that's mostly dudes in robes, at least when it comes to its mages. So having these guys cast like some of your more critical spells would be nice, except for the fact that they're not very good mages, right? They're guaranteed Fire 1, Earth 1, and then, 1 other possible path. So a lot of these guys are, again, just going to be a, 3 split across the board. Sometimes they'll be Fire 2. Sometimes they'll be Earth 2. Theoretically, you could get a Fire 3 or an Earth 3. I would not count on that, which wouldn't be a problem, except for the fact that, right, they're not participating in Flegra's communions by default. So these guys are standalone mages, and a split path at level 1 standalone mage just isn't very useful. The Earth 2s and the Fire 2s are a little more useful, but not fantastic. They are master smiths, level 1. So for crafting purposes, their paths are 1 level higher. So they definitely can craft you some gear that otherwise would be kind of challenging to craft. They are notably not slow to recruit, so you can actually pop these guys out fairly fast, though they're not sacred, they're not slaves, they cost a lot to bring in, and they cost a lot to upkeep. So I don't necessarily know that you would want to bring a lot of these guys in. I perhaps use too many of them in this playthrough. I will say they do give this resource bonus, which I usually think of as being pretty marginal, but since you will be struggling, I think somewhat generally as late age Flegra to get your resources in the it's almost always going to be the limiting factor in your recruitment. So really focusing like a stack of these guys in a place could be kind of significant in terms of being able to replace those losses if you go for kind of a more attritional strategy. But otherwise, kind of a marginal mage. Really only notable because they're a lot more survivable than a lot of your other mages. You could thug or try to use them as like a light super combatant. In the right situation, that can work. I actually have used their predecessors, the Elder Cyclopses, as thugs, though those guys are better mages. They have pretty awful skills, but you give them a brand or something like that, they can work, but there's kind of reasons that you're probably not going to want to go that route, which is really the Tyrants, so we'll talk about them shortly. So your last normal recruit is the Oppressor Archon, another dude in robes, notable for being slow to recruit and pretty expensive. He's also old, which is a bit sad. But these guys are pretty powerful mages. They're guaranteed to have 7 paths, though that is going to be fairly split. They are at least guaranteed to be a 2 in fire or a 2 in earth. They're also your only native astral access, which is useful, but also a double-edged sword. Since you have no other astral access in the nation, these guys are going to be really susceptible to magic duel, and astral is very common in the late age, so you're going to want to try to use these guys as centerpiece casters for your communions, but frankly, whatever you can offload onto the oppressors, you should do. But, with their higher paths and, starting in the communion immediately, there are going to be some spells that it's at least going to be much harder to get your oppressors to be able to cast. And then, of course, anything to do with astral, these are your only guys. They're your only option. Fairly useful in terms of site searching, just because they, search a lot of paths, though at a relatively low level. Again, they come in with some leadership, Taskmaster +2, so, pretty standard. You can lead troops around with these guys as well, though, they're pretty valuable, so probably not going to be leading troops with them all that often. But if you get into a tight spot, they can do it. So that covers it for your normally recruitable units in late age Flegra. But the most important commander, the Tyrants, are not listed here because you cannot recruit them immediately. You can only recruit them once this site, the Burning Mountain, blows up. So before we go any further, you're mostly fire gem income as late age Flegra. So you get 3 per turn from this, and then I believe you get 1 earth gem per turn from this site. So you're guaranteed a little bit of earth income and a decent amount of, a good amount of fire income for the late age. So without further ado, here's the last Dragonian Tyrant. And this fellow is really probably the reason that you would play late age Flegra. Generally regarded as one of the best native super combatant chassis that's recruitable in the game, though I am far from an expert on super combatants. They do have pretty excellent magic access, so they're guaranteed to be Fire 4, which is impressive, Earth 3, which is really good, Death 2, which is useful, also notable for being, your nation's only recruitable death access, and then they have a 10% chance to get a little bit more fire, a little bit more earth, a little bit more death, or possibly the air death crosspath. But, you really shouldn't count on these because fairly unlikely that you're going to get, whatever 10% random that you're really counting on. You probably will get a 10% random, but probably not many more than that for a couple of reasons. So first of all, you cannot recruit these guys until turn 30. And even then, you're not guaranteed to be able to recruit them on turn 30. If the wiki is to be believed, there's a 25% chance that the event happens that allows you to recruit them on turn 30. And then thereafter, every turn, it's that same 25% chance plus 1% every turn. So turn 31, it'll be a 26% chance that the event will happen, and so on and so forth. So generally by turn 34, 35, the event should have happened and you can probably recruit these guys. But if the universe really hates you, it could take significantly longer. Also notable, when that event happens that allows you to recruit them, it kills 20% of your capital's population and generates 40 unrest. I would say when these guys arrive is pretty much the time at which having gold is less of a thing for late age Flegra. And while that capital event is pretty devastating, what in my opinion is probably worse, I don't know why this says that its gold costs 300. That is a lie. These guys cost 600. Pretty easy to remember that because you can basically think of recruiting one of these guys as the exact same cost as building a fort for most nations. So every time you want to recruit one of these guys, it's going to cost you a fort. They are also slow to recruit. You do start with a citadel, which means you start with the 3 commander points. So these guys actually only take 2 turns to bring in. Though once you do bring them in, they'll just kill 70 of the population every turn for whatever province they're in. Perhaps even worse, they'll increase the unrest by 10 every month, every turn. So you definitely do not want these guys just hanging out in your capital or any valuable province. Ideally, they don't really spend hardly any time in your own lands at all. They're also pretty terrible researchers, but again, you don't really want these guys, hanging out in your provinces sitting around researching. Definitely not a good use for them, even if they were good researchers, but they're not. That said, sometimes they may just choose to hang out because they do have 5% shattered soul, so they're a little bit insane. And 5% of the time, they're just going to take some random action rather than you being able to issue them an order. How oppressive this will be will depend on your luck. In my experience, you could mostly ignore it to the point that I would tend to forget about it until there was some critical moment at which they would choose to be insane and I couldn't move them. So yeah, Shattered Soul, a really rough tag. 5%, not the end of the world, but it does have a tendency to crop up. There's never really a good time in Dominions for your units to not take orders. Notably, they're not sacred, right? So their upkeep, I don't know what it is exactly, but in a word, painful. And you can't really fix that. During the game, I experiment with the idea a bit of potentially using shrouds, thinking that it would make them sacred and therefore reduce their upkeep. That is not how shrouds work. Shrouds just make the unit blessed. So you can apply a bless to a non-sacred unit, but it doesn't make the unit sacred. So these guys are just going to cost you an arm and a leg in upkeep no matter what you do. So what does that arm and leg buy you, you might ask? Well, they have excellent hit points. They're size 6, so they can't be trampled. They have pretty good built-in protection. Magic resistance is best in class. They have good morale, though not excellent morale. They do have some leadership, though unfortunately it's actually pretty bad because they are your best taskmaster, so they're actually taskmaster 4. But in practice, they end up being the same as the Mouflon commanders because the units get a penalty from their poor leadership, and they just can't lead that many units anyway. So you could lead some units with them, but not really what they excel at. They have really high strength. They actually have pretty good attack skill. Defense skill, not so fantastic. Precision tends not to come up too much. I guess you could give them a bow, but I wouldn't really recommend it. They're not fast, but they're not slow. And then they have an absolute cornucopia of tags in general, and most of these are positive, right? So they just have built-in 17 fire resistance, 10 poison resistance, a pretty large fear aura, which is a really nice trait to have on a thug or a super combatant. They're a really high-level berserker, so this protection is actually going to go up once they take damage. And this also gets you around a lot of fear plays, right? For a nation that has a lot of problems with morale, the fact that, these guys can berserk and will stay on the field can be a major advantage. Can also sometimes be a problem, as these guys sort of end up being, in the win or die category. They're gluttons, which honestly doesn't really matter too much since there's only one of them and, they're killing a bunch of population and causing a ton of unrest anyway. They do get a siege bonus, not super relevant, but certainly doesn't hurt. They're also a heretic, also not super relevant. In fact, in some ways kind of useful, since ideally these guys are going to be in enemy territory, so therefore removing enemy candles. But just another reason that you don't want them hanging around in your own land. They are unsurroundable, which I don't think really matters too much, since that just means their defense doesn't get driven down as easily, but they don't have very good defense anyway. The reason that they're unsurroundable is relevant, and that is due to all their snake friends who get attacks of their own. So built in, these guys have 4 attacks, and they can throw a boulder, which I did not know. I don't think you really would want to use this too often, but it's there, I guess. Their built-in armor is not good. But you're probably going to be giving full kit to all of these guys anyway, since you're not going to have that many of them. Their built-in weapon, also not fantastic. But again, you should be replacing these things, so not that big a deal. They also have built-in recuperation, which is extremely nice on super combatants. So, afflictions that they get, they'll be able to heal them away automatically. And they're combat casters as well, which isn't as relevant, but they are pretty powerful mages. And so they'll still be able to cast more effectively than most mages once they get into melee. And apparently they're also a poor amphibian. I'll have to double check this. I didn't realize this. I definitely do give these guys water-breathing items at various points, which apparently I didn't need to do. Also notable is they do not like helmets. They can only wear crowns. So these guys, absolute beasts in multiple senses of the word. And you could probably make a whole video on them. I'm not going to dive into them too much. But, notably with the pass that they have with the Death Gem, you can cast Soul Vortex, which is pretty useful, since they don't have any nature paths and no built-in regeneration. Regeneration is maybe something you would want to put on your Bless if you're going to go the route of slapping shrouds on these guys. They also have Earth, which lets them get their protection up even higher, gives them Temper Flesh. Summon Earth Power to help with reinvigoration, which can be important for super combatants and thugs. The Fire Magic, not as useful for super combatants, though if you wanted to, you could try some sort of Phoenix Pyre situation. But of course, does open up a lot of evocation casting. Oftentimes, I would just set these guys to advance and cast spells with, their full kit. So it's like, hey, once they get into melee, great, they can melee, but they are combat casters. They're really powerful casters. Why limit them to just melee? That does mean that they'll, more or less fatigue out, which, will make them more susceptible to critical hits and will reduce their attack and defense skill. But since they're mostly relying on a large hit point pool and, higher protection, I think that that's not the end of the world. But, you might not want to go that route if you feel that, having that really high fatigue level is not something you want. But yeah, if you're playing late-age Flegra, you definitely want to recruit at least some of these guys. Now, again, because they're going to be destroying whatever land they're in, and they cost a ton to recruit, and they cost a ton to upkeep, the exact number of which you should be recruiting is still an unsolved question in my mind. If things are going well, you probably never stop recruiting these guys. But if you're being forced to fight a defensive war where these guys are spending time in your own territory and you're not capturing new territory, you're going to find it increasingly more difficult to, recruit anything. So I definitely think this is a unit that you can over-recruit and get yourself into trouble with. On the other hand, since you can't start recruiting them until at least turn 30 and they come in quite slowly, it would be very easy to under-recruit them as well. So absolutely a fascinating unit, a unit that does not need a Bless. I absolutely think that, you can gear these guys out pretty effectively, though running them as solo super combatants isn't really going to work against good players. But that's really more, I think, a Dominions 5 balance situation versus any fault of these guys. I think generally where these guys will be let down, magic resistance, 18 is pretty high. But against dedicated opponents, it absolutely can be overwhelmed. Protection 19, also fairly high. But if you go the route of using a Shroud, you're never really going to be able to get that protection to a place where these guys are safe against really hard-hitting units. But if you don't go the route of a bless, obviously, they have no cold resistance, they have no shock resistance. You can gear for that, but, it's always a trade-off, so you're always going to have some sort of hole with these guys. Really probably the only way to avoid that, or at least the fastest way and simplest way to remove as many holes as possible, right, is giving them some sort of bless that, covers what they don't have. But again, that leaves your protection relatively low as the Shroud doesn't provide all that much protection. You're probably better off using these guys, in armies. Potentially actually relatively small armies that, are kind of just designed to be burned off around them, kind of leaning into that attritional play, where the army, provides cover for them, both in terms of, things like Soul Slay, in which case those really low magic resistance Cyclopses are perhaps kind of a boon, which is definitely not something that occurred to me initially, because those are going to be really appealing targets for enemy mages, which means that, your tyrants are going to be seeing a lot fewer magic resistance checks. And then, a bunch of random, human soldiers that are going to be soaking up a lot of physical damage. I think it's also probably worth noting that casting Firestorm, once you research it, is pretty easy for these guys. Firestorm is definitely not always a spell that's useful, but in a lot of situations it can be pretty devastating. So, rolling out a bunch of mid-sized armies, each of which can just drop Firestorm every combat, while also being relatively immune to it itself, since you have built-in pretty heavy armor on most of your units and a lot of fire magic, so getting fire resistance on your units shouldn't be that difficult, is definitely notable. Late Age Flegra also gets some national spells. Most of these are shared with the other Greek-themed nations. I think probably the most useful of them is Sow Dragon Teeth, which gets you 10 really useful battle summons. These fellows, if you've seen some of my other playthroughs, definitely have used these guys before. I think these guys are so useful that potentially you might want to try to cast Earthblood Deepwell, and then use them as a front line for your crossbowmen, like in your heavy attritional armies. Though that said, you don't really have the Earth income to support that. You definitely will need to, do a good amount of site searching for Earth, and that will be something that you'd need to build your Pretender for, because you do not have the paths for it to cast Earthblood Deepwell. But whether or not you have Earthblood Deepwell, this is a useful spell. You also get Procession of the Underworld. I do think these Lampads are pretty useful, definitely interesting units. If you turn them into Commander with something like Gift of Reason, they do have a little bit of diversity implications for you. You don't have any nature magic nationally, and you do not have the Astral Nature Crosspath, or the Astral Death Crosspath for that matter. But even though it's the Late Age, you can probably find some nature ones out there. So this is pretty marginal. And, as units, they're okay, but you're not going to be able to start searching for death until at least turn 30, and you're going to have to search with the Tyrants, who you want to get out of your land as quickly as possible. So while you definitely, in my opinion, should do some searching with the Tyrants for death gems, it's going to be happening rather late, and it's going to be somewhat spotty, because you're not going to want to search every single province with the Tyrants in all likelihood, both because they'll be destroying whatever lands they move through, and you'll probably want to use them in your wars. So all this to say that you're not going to have a ton of death gems, and you probably have better things, right? You probably have equipment needs with your Tyrants, so I don't think this is as useful of a spell for Late Age Flegra. Similarly, these cares are one way. Again, if you commanderize them, you can break into blood this way. I do think that that's kind of one of Late Age Flegra's problems is, while the Tyrants are pretty powerful and they have decent troops and, fairly fearsome if painful communions, all of this does tend to drop off a bit in the late game. So breaking into blood with cares isn't the craziest plan, but it is going to be quite expensive, and the spell doesn't show up until Conjuration 6. And again, you need 12 death gems, though since turning them into commanders is even more expensive and you get 3 of them per cast, it's probably not going to be the death gems that's going to be limiting you. But still, it is, going to be burning some of your limited death gems. So if you really want to break into blood, I say go for it. Otherwise, probably ignore this spell as well. And then speaking of spells to ignore, I'm not particularly impressed by any of these. I would like to like the Hound of Twilight. I think he's a cool unit. He does get a patrol bonus, which is a little more relevant on late age Flegra than a lot of other nations. But otherwise, fairly like mage inefficient. You only get one of them. And they're going to be competing for Earth Gems with your forging, as well as your battle summons. So maybe a few for patrolling, but otherwise probably ignore them. The Brass Bull, I think, is just too expensive, even though they are pretty cool and they do breathe fire. I wouldn't hold it against you if you summoned them, but it's also probably not the most effective use of gems. It also comes pretty late, right? Construction 7 is probably something you'll want to go to as late age Flegra. You'll probably want to go to Construction 6 since you're a Fire Nation, and then you can make lanterns. And once you're at Construction 6, Weapons of Sharpness is really useful. You do have a good amount of Earth magic. You get Weapons of Sharpness at Construction 7. But, you know, you're not going to have Brass Bulls early, and I just don't think they're worth the cost. Gigantomachia, getting giggity with the giants, I think probably isn't worth the Earth Gem investment. It's also down Thaumaturgy 7. Thaumaturgy, I think, is not a super high priority school for late age Flegra. You get a Dominion conflict bonus, which isn't super useful since you probably don't want very high Dominion anyway. It will make your tyrants a little cheaper to recruit, though again, I think probably not worth all the Earth Gems. Most notably for Flegra, it will let you recruit tyrants, but as units with a limit of 1 per fort. I'm not really sure how worth it is. I suspect probably not that worth it. They will be very powerful units, but I mean, you're probably just better off sticking with the commanders, and I imagine that they're going to be pretty expensive. And that covers their national-only spells.